Good evening. I'm Linnell Thomas, a professor of American Studies and a native of New Orleans. Thank you for being here at the second Sankofa series, Campus and Community Conversation, Broadening an Anti-Racist and Health Promoting Vision. Thank you for all of you who have come tonight, and thank you as well to all of the people who have come together to make this happen. Our panelists, the Academic Continuity Task Force, the Restorative Justice Initiative. Before I begin, I just want to take a moment to recognize that many of us in the UMass Boston community are still grieving the loss of David Turkla, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, who passed away last week. And I also want us to take a moment to recognize all the people who lost their lives as a result of COVID-19. And I want us to remember all of the people who have lost their lives to anti-Black violence and a racialized criminal justice system. Like many of you tonight, I am feeling grief-stricken and aggrieved. And I spent all day yesterday tracking Hurricane Zeta to see it make landfall near New Orleans, the fifth named storm that has hit southern Louisiana this year. Over 15 years after Hurricane Katrina, and we still know which communities are the most at risk and which are the least equipped to recover and rebuild. We know how public policy and private industry continue to create and exacerbate gross inequities in wealth, healthcare, housing, criminal justice, and environmental safety. I appreciate that the organizers call this the Sankofa Conversation Series on Structural Racism. Structural racism is what ties COVID to Katrina. It is what sanctions police killings of unarmed Black people. It is what has brought us here tonight to find some catharsis for our collective grief and find a way to transform that grief and anger into action. One of the most powerful things about the last conversation for me was that it provided a forum for Black women who articulated a demand for measures, concrete measures, promoting and protecting and retaining Black women faculty, staff, and students. Hearing their perspectives made it clear that it is not about self-confession or self-congratulation. We are not going to get there from Juneteenth holidays or Black Lives Matter days. The only way to address structural inequality is to make structural changes. I'm so humbled by the young people who are leading this movement for structural change. They have taken up the mantle of Black Lives Matter, which is founded by queer Black women, a movement that is inclusive, coalitional, and that centers the voices and experiences of people who have been sidelined and maligned, even in other movements for Black liberation. Black women, Black queer and trans people, people with criminal records, the undocumented, the disabled, the discarded. These are models that we have to help us conceptualize being an anti-racist, health-promoting institution. And our panelists tonight will help us to expand our thinking beyond the university to the broader community. Dr. Denise Patman is tonight's moderator, and we are joined by Dr. Shirley Tang from Asian American Studies, Vickiana Petithomme, an undergraduate student organizer, Yvette Modestine from Encuentro Diaspora Afro, Professor Rosalind Negron from Anthropology, Lisa Owens, the Executive Director of City Life, La Vida Urbana, Professor Eduardo Sigera, Public Health at School for the Environment, State Representative Liz Miranda, and Professor Corroy Ferguson from Psychology. So I'll hand it over to Denise.
Thank you, Professor Thomas, for that riveting introduction. You always bring New Orleans to us here in Boston. It is my honor to serve as tonight's moderator. We are so fortunate to have an outstanding panel representing diverse experiences and opinions from our UMass Boston campus and its surrounding community. Those of us who had the opportunity to attend or view the tape of the first Sankofa conversation left with an understanding of how critical it is that we act in this moment of promise for true and sustaining institutional change as we progress toward becoming an anti-racist university. These online conversations during our current pandemic are purposed to move us in that direction, which causes a sort of clumsy process. Number one, we in the United States have had a poor track record of being involved in authentic cross-racial, cross-cultural conversations about racism in our country. Be they beer summits or teaching tolerance. I mean, who wants to merely be tolerated? And number two, there are a few protocols that exist to help guide us to assure we discuss that which preoccupies our minds, especially concerning race and racism. The overarching themes from these Sankofa conversation is understanding history, transforming values, building equity. And the themes from the first conversation, which was moderated by my esteemed colleague, Professor Jemadari Kamara, were curriculum issues, as Professor Thomas reminded us what resonated with her, women of color, faculty of color, hiring, promotion, retention, leadership appointments, collaborating across campuses and within our communities, white faculty asking for anti-racist training, cultural healing practices, student voices, engagement, and what's really important, accountability. And I want to say and have us do something around the accountability. Tonight's focus is on campus and community conversation about broadening an anti-racist and health promoting vision with a focus on our campus in relation to the greater Boston area. I hope that tonight speaks to you, the audience. Something drew you to this critical initiative at this time. There are so many other things that you could be doing right now, but you decided to join us. What interests me the most about this conversation series on structural racism is my hope that these exchanges spur you to action. There's so much work to do. Where do we begin? There are several programs that are being planned across UMass Boston and the community at large. But what truly interests me is your individual commitment. What are you willing to do to join the coalition, to make a difference, to do more than just tune in and listen to folks of color on this rainy autumn evening? So in that spirit, I ask you to engage in a very short exercise to focus your questions to the panelists and perhaps impact your subsequent behavior around these 4 points that arise from my face theory research. How do you show up for anti-racism work? You might want to jot these down just so that you're accountable to yourself. My face theory is founded on the work of Shusaku Endo. So first of all, what is your outside face? What role do you play at the university or in the greater Boston community? How do people see you? How do you interface with Black people, with people of color? Take a moment to just jot, what is your outside public face? Next, what is your inside face? What role do you play within the department or the college or the staff of which you belong? How do your peers see you? How does this relate to Black people, to people of color? What is your more intimate face in terms of race and racism in what you do? Thirdly, what is your pure face? How do you see yourself in your role? What are your intentions in relation to working with the UMass Boston community on and off campus, moving toward becoming an anti-racist institution? What is your role? Will you assure the hiring of more people of color, of Black faculty in your department? What is your intention? And finally, the unknown face. And this is the most promising phase. What might you do differently to ensure campus movement toward an anti-racist stance? What risks might you take to move the agenda forward? What resources do you need to be an anti-racist contributor to our UMass Boston community and its environments? Okay, so you've located your voice yourself, hopefully, using these four faces. Perhaps you can see clearly why you are here tonight and what you need to do to grow as an anti-racist, to fight back racist proclivities and white supremacy, no matter who you are or what your role is. So this is how we will proceed moving forward. We ask that you submit your questions in the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen, throughout the next 2 hours. The conference organizers, Professors Keith Jones and Tony Vandermeer, will operate the back channel communique to make sure that I receive your questions in a timely fashion to raise with the panelists. And we will try to make this as seamless as possible. Each panelist will be providing a brief opening statement about our focus tonight. And again, that's on campus and community, broadening and anti-racist and health promoting vision. There will be 3 clusters. At the end of each cluster, I will initiate conversation based on your questions. So the first cluster has a loose interconnectivity thread that deals with the physical assault of racism on our bodies, on our minds, and on our communities. We will hear first from Dr. Shirley Tang, whose digital storytelling innovation has hit the campus just magically. So Shirley, Dr. Tang, please begin.
Thank you so much, Denise, Linnell, Tony, and Keith. And thanks to each of you in the audience for being here. It means a lot to us. Denise, I'm putting on my unknown face now. The face behind the masks. And I'm feeling what that means. What you are saying, Denise, just now. Okay, so I'm sure you all noticed the immediate resignation by the Boston School Committee chair after he was caught with his microphone on, mocking the names of Asian immigrant parents who were speaking before the school committee exactly 1 week ago. One issue I want to push strongly in our anti-racism and health promoting work is non-Western language discrimination. There are many levels of disrespect and dehumanization. And here I honor the decolonizing dedication exemplified by Gloria Ansel-Dua's unapologetic bilingual tongue and Ngugi wa Thiong'o's call to fellow African writers to produce work in their native languages, and the local Wampanoag tribe of Mashpee for the ongoing language reclamation project. We all know about the pandemic's intense and viral anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and I have documented those experiences with our students. Yet, the mocking of Asian names and languages by the leader of the Boston Public Schools Governing Board says so much about the need to uphold cultures and languages as part of the demands and movements for social justice with our students and communities and among ourselves. The recent BPS School Committee story also raises another important question. After you get rid of something, what do you replace it with? Insisting that the school committee chair should resign was not hard, but who will replace him? That is not so easy or clear. Similarly, even if an effective, widely distributed vaccine can get rid of the COVID-19 coronavirus in our bodies, it doesn't mean that we become healthy. It is one urgent and necessary step, but does not remedy or heal the conditions of structural sickness from which we also need inoculation, relief, and recovery. Or to use a different metaphor, the big question for me as a teacher scholar, specifically based within a strong ethics studies academic unit, is what can we build within the master's house? While being conscious that the foundations and colors and aromas and sounds and energy fields of the home place we are designing is also not the master's house. To be in, but not of, as W.E.B. Du Bois described. Everyone here knows that inequality in Boston is complicated and deeply rooted. We live in one of the most stratified regions in the country for higher education. The richest, most powerful private universities in the world are on the same subway line as UMass Boston. But we are the region's only university that is federally designated as a minority serving institution, or MSI. We are an NAPC, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution, a parallel to HBCUs, HSIs, and tribal colleges. And specifically through our NAPC work, we have generated $6.6 million in federal education grants for the university during the past decade for student support, relevant educational research, faculty, staff, and curriculum development in Asian American studies and K-12, as well as community youth engagement. Our house actually has specific institutional statuses, which are important for us to understand, look back to connect with, reconnect with, and look forward in proudly claiming. Our MSI NAPC federal designation, combined with our long-standing charter as an urban public university, and our soon-to-be renewed Carnegie Foundation classification for community engagement, mean that our institutional commitments to communities of color engagement must always be serious and accountable. In other words, by claiming and putting our roots down with these specific intersecting institutional identities, we, meaning the faculty, staff, administrators, students, alumni, are holding ourselves to a much higher standard than most in being an anti-racist and health-promoting campus. I want to briefly address educational gentrification. The wealth gap and continuing gentrification in Boston's neighborhoods have a strong parallel in the university. Some of the changes that took place at UMass Boston in the name of higher status have primarily targeted a wealthier, younger student body, while disinvesting in our historic, older adult, working class, immigrant of color student profiles. Dealing with that reality takes many forms at many levels. I think it requires a few interventions, and I will stop soon. Many of you know about my digital storytelling work with students and community partners in Asian American studies for the past 17 years. And more recently, through collaborative research and production projects with Native youth and with Langston University and HBCU in Oklahoma, and especially with BIPOC populations at Bunker Hill Community College in both ethnic studies and STEM fields, where the working class immigrant students of color are more concentrated now than at UMass Boston. And fundamentally, what that's been about is decolonizing the curriculum, pedagogies of wholeness, epistemic justice, collaborative participatory methodologies to be producers, not consumers, centering student voices and understanding knowledge co-production with students as community sources through the stable, secure, sustainable structure of our curriculum and pedagogical practices in Asian American studies. So to build the kind of leading anti-racist, health-promoting campus that we want, we have to find students, staff, and faculty who won't assimilate into the gentrified definition of excellence or desirability across generations. In my applied research class this semester, I work with student leaders and alumni, all of them young women of color, Jaylee, Celine, Leani, Kirsten, Amini, Nia, and others, to access anti-decolonial ways of knowing and being, engage in the struggle of the mind and feminist theorizing, and affirm women of color leadership. We have to develop people, support systems, and reward structures at all levels of the campus to, and I quote Nancy Cantor here, break open that hegemony of closed opportunity and closed voices and the ridiculously narrow definition of excellence that never includes lived experience in its fullest sense, unquote. We don't want business as usual, teaching as usual, research as usual, anti-racism as usual. We demand more. This is our house. And I really look forward to the presentations by Vickiana and Yvette. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wow, Dr. Tang, there's much to be discussed with what you've just shared with us. Thank you so much. Now let's hear from our student representative, Vickiana Petit-Homme, who is Regional Director and Organizer of March of Our Lives.
Hello. Hi, I wasn't sure if you were done. Hi, y'all. My name is Vickiana Petit-Homme. I am a sophomore here at UMass Boston, majoring in political science. I use she, her pronouns, if you would like to address me. So right now we're talking about creating and broadening an anti-racist and health-promoting vision here at UMass Boston and beyond. And so we have to consider the physicality of racism. Racism not only takes a mental toll on the person receiving harm, but also a physical toll, both on an individual level and a community level. Experiencing racism is tiring, body draining, and stress-inducing. And stress wreaks havoc on the body and mind. We know that African Americans and Black folks are disproportionately more at risk of getting heart disease, lung disease, and diabetes, and so many other types of health concerns. And due to these underlying conditions, we even see that we are more likely to be affected by the coronavirus. Here in Massachusetts, a 10% point increase in the Black population is associated with 312 more cases per 100,000 people. You know, so these effects are carrying on to even now. These historical discriminations, institutional racism are carrying on even to now in this pandemic that we're facing. Not to mention, Black children are being taught from a very young age to hate themselves and to view themselves as a problem. Imagine the effects that has on a young mind. It is a psychological warfare going on. We even find that Black folks have post-traumatic stress disorder from their experiences with racism. These are the actual physical tolls that racism have on the body. And this is all in addition to the overt brutality we face when it comes to police and these so-called authorities. The point is, this is all trauma. And that trauma is being passed down from generation to generation, especially when no healing is taking place. And so the question is, how do we prevent this? And when it does happen, how do we help those experiencing racism re-energize and heal? So to that first question of how do we prevent this? Well, we have to have a UMass Boston that is anti-racist at its core. That means first, defunding campus police, investing more into therapists, counselors, and resources for our students. Second, creating a fluid and community-guided and approved curriculum. We must create a curriculum and a staff that reflects the values of the communities that this institution claims to serve. So that means more meetings like these, more conversations like these. That means going out and actually talking to these families of these students, asking them, what would you like your child to be taught? What values do you hold? And how do we exude that into the curriculum? And we must create a curriculum that helps non-Black students reckon with the racism and how they personally perpetuate it, and help Black folks unlearn the internalized racism that they hold. So one proposal that I've heard that's been offered, and I think is essential to achieving this goal, is making Africana Studies 101 mandatory for all undergraduate students wishing to graduate. I think that is a great first step to achieving an anti-racist UMass Boston. And third, we have to hire more Black women as professors, administrators, general staff, and just more into leadership so that our staff and the people who hold authority in this place actually reflect the students. And finally, we must make sure that white and non-Black professors and staff undergo anti-racist training so that they are not perpetuating it in their classrooms. And to the second question of how do we help those experiencing racism re-energize and heal? Well, to be clear, true and transformative healing cannot be achieved until the issue of racism and both institutional and overt, is actively dismantled. And a system of transformative justice, collective care, and community is built in its place. Second, we must create and invest in affinity spaces that allow our students to have a brave space to address their experiences with the people who can relate to them. And finally, we must, as an institution, consciously decide that the students' overall health, mental and physical, is more important than following this rigid guideline of how to graduate, because learning is a process of development, and that development can take different times to happen. And so what's important is making sure that people have a healthy mind to engage in these lessons that they're taking part of in their classrooms. So it's all about being truly committed as an institution to take the necessary steps needed to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Petithomme. That was so visionary, and I look forward to following your leadership in the future, the very near future. Next, we will hear from Ms. Yvette Modestine, please, who is the founder and executive director of Encuentro Diaspora Afro.
Good evening, everyone. Buenas tardes. Giving thanks to those whose shoulders I stand on. And I want to dedicate my time tonight to the person who brought me closer to the UMass community, who is still a guiding force to my work, which is City Councilor Chuck Turner. In starting that way, before I get to the nitty-gritty of the conversation, I want to share why tonight is so important to me and to Encuentro Diaspora Afro. I see myself, although I've never formally taken a class at UMass, I feel that I've been a student of UMass Boston, personally and professionally. A great deal of my ability to still stand while our body, our mind, our hair, our spirit has been under attack is in great part due to a lot of the folks at UMass Boston. So tonight I want to publicly give thanks, and many people have heard me say this, to Dr. Jimidari Kamara, Dr. Tony Vandermeer, Dr. Esther Shapiro, Dr. Prophet James Jennings, and I want to give thanks to Keith and Tony for putting this together. In 2004, I had the first Afro-Latino conference in Boston, the Afro-Latino gathering in Boston, Y tu abuela donde está. Chuck directed me, and we got Northeastern, and it was sort of like, who do I need to speak to? And he said, you need to go speak to Prophet James Jennings, who many people do not know is Afro-Puerto Rican. He then directs me to Andres Torres, who was then the director of the Gaston Institute, who, without knowing much about me, sat with me and created the 10 key questions to that first conference that then became the guiding questions in the founding of Encuentro Diaspora Afro. Then comes in Dr. Esther Shapiro, and her psychology department helped shape the evaluation of our young people's program in our high school. I then also have had the opportunity to work with Shirley. Tony and Jimidari not only become advisors to Encuentro, but also are, aside from the institutions that my parents sent me to as an immigrant child from Panama to come study in Boston, it was meeting Tony and Jimidari that I finally felt seen in Boston. Not only personally, but seen through an institution. Because UMass Boston was able to see what it was to be an Afro-Latina, a Black woman from Latin America, and what that looked like because of your own students that were also Afro-Latinos. I also have had the opportunity to work with Dr. Swan, who's now the director of the Trotter Institute, who he and I go way back. So I was one of those that advocated for him to be there. And also worked closely with Dr. Leila Vincent. We worked together in Venezuela. And recently, when we talk about the healing and the mental health, and during this pandemic, one of the many hats that I wear is as a community organizer for the Codman Square NDC. And in thinking about what the community needed, because what we saw was we can give you the food, we can get the hotspot, we can get the internet, but our mental health and our emotional health was under attack during these times. And who do I turn to? I turn to Dr. Cuff Ferguson, who does our 2 opening community wellness series, followed by the next 2 series by Dr. Tahira Abdullah. Why is this all so important? Because UMass to me has been one of the few spaces in the city that centers Blackness. Not only in the conversation around Black power, Black healing, Black love, but centers Blackness even within the Latino community that is anti-Black in its movement. The 2 largest Latino communities in Boston are the Dominican community and the Puerto Rican community. It is a known fact that those 2 communities are anti-Black in their understanding of self. That is a historical fact. What has been interesting is that UMass Boston has been one of the few places that has supported Encuentro in having that conversation as a community, as Boston as a whole, and for your students. 2 of Encuentro's greatest events were a conversation between Latino students and Haitian students, Dominican students to be specific. You had students crying, you had students who were adults, and this was their first time having a conversation around the internal racism that they deal with in their communities. studies. But why were we able to have that conversation that most spaces historically still cannot have today was because UMass Boston, the Africana Studies Department, and professors as Esther Shapiro, Jemadari Kamara, Tony Vandermeer were willing to create the space to have those critical dialogues. So not only did I see myself personally as a Black immigrant woman within this institution, I saw the organization within. And it's through that that I became part of the center and have worked closely with the department. Why is tonight important? Because that inclusive connecting message that I saw for many years was under attack from this community's perspective, when instead of standing tall as an authentic representation of Boston, UMass Boston seems to be struggling with wanting to see yourself equally to the bigger name institutions who do not see community. So in going back to what Ms. Denise said at the beginning, the question to me tonight, UMass, as someone who has been walking closely with this institution, is how do you, which is a question we ask in our trainings around identity. Because if you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're going, which is appropriate that this series is called Sankofa, because you got to know where you came from to know where you're going. So I'm challenging UMass in this conversation to ask itself, how do you truly identify yourself? And how do you want others to identify you? Why did it feel for a period of time that instead of standing on this authentic, unique, embracing, open space that everyone gets seen, the last 2 years has seemed to be a struggle with wanting to identify yourself within these other institutions that on a daily basis, on a given day, most of your students are not seen, are not heard, and are not invited. And that became almost the energy of the UMass space. The Africana department is a key department in that institution. Why was it under attack? What does it mean? Because it's not just about the department. It's about what the department represents. It's about the conversations that the department brings forth. Was the institution as a whole ready for it? No, that's not what it was looking like the last few years. Especially the fact that those in charge and making the decisions of what and who was going to do what did not look like the department, did not understand the department, would not even sit and listen to the students on how much they learned, may they be Black, white, Asian, stood there before administration and said, I learned what I learned. I've had the first conversation about racism, internal racism, not loving my hair, not loving my skin as a Latina came out of this department. And it was minimized. So it is time, if we are really about to do this, it is time to heal inside and out, because the community was also hurt in this process. It is time for reparative justice, which means you have to repair the damage that is done. Reparations at times mean some folks need to get out the way. Well, and there are folks that probably need to get out the way. And also it's time for transformative change. So I look forward to staying involved in this conversation because it's not just a personal interest of mine, it's a professional interest because it's one of the few spaces that I think is willing and ready to have the real conversation.
Well, thank you very much for acknowledging that history, that impact that UMass has made on your life and on the life of the community. The question from the audience now, we're going to take a moment and please, I remind you to place your questions in the Q&A or in the chat box. But we have one question that I'd like to share to have a real quick response, like a 5-minute response, because we need to get to the second cluster, is about racism. And each of you talked about racism in practice, especially how it has impacted you, but oftentimes it can mean different things to different people. Throughout the conversation, we've been using the word in an academic context, in a community context, in a personal context, with complex historic and socioeconomic meaning in mind. However, when the layperson speaks about racism, they have much simpler one-dimensional understandings of it. How do we reconcile this gap in understanding and definitions? And what operational definition of racism would you like to see UMass Boston adapt? And it's open to the three of you. Please, be mindful of your time because we have to move on to the next panelist, but just to get some.
I think UMass, and I think, in conversations with Tony and Jim Dari and Keith, is the People's Institute Against Racism is, I'm trained by them. I think their training not only goes around racism as power and control, it also taps into your own internal biases. And those are some of the things that need to come out because, as we're hearing lately with the Black Lives Matter, not all skin folks are kin folks. So even Black folks need to decolonize their mindsets, and even some of your professors need to decolonize some of their mindsets on how they have their biases towards the community, towards their students.
Thank you. Dr. Tang?
Yeah, I understand the question as how can we make it real for everyday life and everyday people? And also maybe connecting conversation between academics who talk a certain way and people out there who might talk this way. So somehow it made me think of the COVID-19 Outbreak Racism Stories project that I launched in spring 2020 through the two courses that I was teaching. So there were so many issues related to anti-Asian racism and xenophobia and people's mental health issues, loss of jobs, and just a whole range of issues. And so I think it is very important when we talk about racism to really understand where people are from and really trying to find ways to engage people in that conversation. And, as Yvette said just now, we have to find decolonizing ways to engage people in that conversation. So I think that is my quick response. Mm-hmm. I can also post in the chat box a link to those stories, and I think that will make everything real.
Yes, mm-hmm. Yes, please give resources. People want that very much. Thank you. Ms. Petito?
Yeah, so my professor that I'm learning all of this from is actually like on the back end of this. So hopefully I make him proud. But we define racism in class as race prejudice plus power. And so that power aspect is really important. It's one thing to have race prejudice, but you have to have the institutional, the economic and the societal power to actually make someone's life worse off for it. And so you have to take that all in. And then that all goes into, internalized oppression, where, you have Black folks and people of color internalizing some of that power, some of that language and rhetoric they're hearing and actually believing it. And then you also have the opposite end where it's like internalized superiority, where you have white folks believing that they're actually better because they're white.
Yeah, I would only add, thank you for sharing that, Ms. Petito. I would only add the foundation of capitalism, that money and power allows for structural racism, and discrimination is that action of prejudice. But we will move on. I thank the first cluster very much for launching us into what I think will become an even deeper conversation. The interconnectivity thread in the second cluster concerns a broadened conception of what health promoting means in relation to our lived experiences incorporating disease, social emotional health, and dis-ease, like housing and community displacement. To start us in that direction of our conversation, Dr. Ruslan Negron from the Anthropology Department, whose research is in sociocultural urban anthropology, will start us off. So, Ruslan?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you, everyone. I feel very privileged to be part of this powerful panel, truly humbled. I also want to hold and acknowledge what Yvette shared in her talk and the way that she highlighted how much wealth we have to work with here at UMass Boston. I was really struck by this idea that even as we know there is so much work to do, that we're not starting from nothing, and we're actually doing a lot better, I think, than a lot of institutions. So thank you, Yvette, for reminding me of that. That was incredibly motivating for me, and I appreciate that. So I am a cultural anthropologist who does work in a few different areas. One of them happens to be health and health disparities. So I want to talk, actually I should time myself because I know we have 3 to 5 minutes. I want to talk a little bit about the culture piece, and I want to talk a little bit about the health promoting piece, which is the focus of this section. So we are here to try to understand how to dismantle structural racism at UMass Boston, the ways that it manifests specifically at UMass Boston. And I want to just nod to the fact that that process itself, that work itself, is a way to achieve health and well-being. So what we're trying to do is create an institutional environment that promotes health, but I want to emphasize that the process of doing that work promotes all of our health and those that are involved in it. And I'll come back to that idea later on, but there are a few demands that have been put on the table already that have to do with representation in leadership. So achieving racial equity in representation, leadership, and governance. There are a series of recommendations that have to do with policy. So in terms of dismantling structural racism, we have to talk about a commitment to policies that challenge institutional arrangements that benefit white folks over others. And if you read the CIFER report, you will see that there already are a whole host of policies that are concrete and actionable, and already are moving us in the direction of what can be done. And then there is another piece that is much more challenging. And to be honest, you know, the part that I struggled with, both as an anthropologist, but, you know, for me personally, which is about dismantling structural racism through different ways of doing things. And our values change, which it has to do and has been spoken about in the past in terms of culture change. And I struggle with this as an anthropologist because I understand what it takes, some process of culture change. I think policy is absolutely important to that, but I think you know, cultures are so embedded. It's what we swim in that we take for granted, that to understand what it is that we're swimming in and then to systematically undo that is incredibly difficult work. It involves, on the one hand, an ability to do a cultural analysis of, for example, white supremacist culture. Like, what does that actually look like and how does it manifest itself? And we think about some of the attributes of that. For example, hierarchical thinking, defining things and people in terms of worth, separation and boundaries, reducing, you know, reductionism, reducing especially individuals rather than seeing them in terms of their wholeness. And of course, power and control as a chief orientation. But there are many other subtle ways that that culture manifests itself. And actually doing a culture analysis of that, it's difficult, and it's an important challenge. There's also some inner work, which Denise, you spoke to with your 4 sort of calls to us, which is critical to this work. You know, the private work, the reflection, the meditations, the prayers, the inner conversations. All of those things are important to it, to be able to kind of develop a lens for seeing things that are just so subtle. I guess I'll turn for the last minute or so to this question of what it means to create a health promoting environment. So as I said before, health promotion through anti-racist work, and health, and then doing anti-racist work to promote health. I think we want to be thinking about both of those things. And when we talk about health, we can think about it in a few different ways. And Eduardo is a doctor here, so he can speak to this much better, medical doctor here, so he can speak to it much better. So we have the sort of our biological understanding of health, and, you know, safety from bodily harm as health, which we can ask some questions about that, whether as an institution, we are doing enough to create safety from bodily harm, especially as it manifests itself through racism and anti-Blackness. And there are some obvious ways that have to do, for example, Vickiana talked about campus police and defunding. That's sort of an obvious place to kind of think about potential physical assaults on our community. Is our campus a harbor and a protection to those who are in threat of bodily harm, and how so? What about air quality and exposure to environmental harms, especially those that our staff, and especially given that so many of them are Black, brown, and immigrant, that they are exposed to. To me, it was sort of amazing to know a few years ago how in Healy Library, the Gaston Institute, and some of the other office spaces there had to get special air cleaners to not breathe in harmful air, right? So, you know, when we talk about safety from bodily harm and doing and sort of health promotion, we really do have to be thinking about biological health. And of course, there's stress and stressors, which others in the previous panelists talked about. For me, as a faculty member, I have to say that the greatest areas of stress for me have been around the massive amounts of work and labor, some of it which I do sort of wholeheartedly and fully knowing that I'm getting myself into trouble, and some of it that is sort of don't know how to get myself out of. But there are massive stressors in this university. And as a Latina who has had many conversations with other women of color faculty in which there are tears and desperation and heartbreak because of feeling just completely underwater, I know that it is completely sort of embodied, right? Inequalities in service are embodied as a stressor. But there are other dimensions, and I'm sorry that I'm running over time, but I just want to quickly talk about other things that we know are important for people's health: meaning and purpose. We think about our curriculums and how they can promote not just skills as a good, but values-based education that can help our students connect to meaning and purpose in the way that they define it, or the way that it might be defined in such a way that faculty and the work and the research that they do, and as they're trying to align their work with meaning and purpose, that it's seen and valued when it comes to tenure and promotion and their job security. And the final thing, which is the most fundamental thing in a lot of ways that we know from lots of health research, that is perhaps the most important thing for people's health, and that's relationships, bonds, and belonging. And here again, I want to make a call to this possibility of doing anti-racist work as a way to build relationship, to build a sense of belonging, and to become healthy individually and collectively as a result.
Thank you, dear sister. Thank you very much. You've shared so much, and I sit here daring to imagine co-teaching a course with you. There's a question in the chat box from someone in the nursing department who wants to know ideas. Well, I can see us imagining working beyond silos. Thank you very much, Professor Negron. Shall we now move on to Dr. Eduardo Sigera, Public Health Coordinator of Transnational Brazilian Project here at UMass Boston. His expertise is in environmental justice, environmental influences on human health, immigrant health and safety. Welcome to the panel, dear Eduardo.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight in this panel. Thanks for everybody who organized it. The time has come. It's time for us to open up to the serious problems that we have to face in this society. And what I'm going to speak from to broaden the discourse and the conversation is a global aspect to what we're talking about. Many of us at UMass Boston live in more than one world. We live in the United States and we live somewhere else. Our experience of racism are different than what we have in the United States. And to broaden this conversation, especially from the immigrant perspective, which is how I see myself, I'm an immigrant to the United States, and I am not from the third world. The third world is an expression of racism that we should stop from our language. There's no such a thing as first, second, and third world. There is an empire. We'll talk a lot about colonialism. I would like to raise the idea of imperialism. In the 21st century, that's what we're dealing with. And we live in a country that is the major empire in the world and classifies other peoples according to its interests into first, second, third, and that is a problem if you live in more than one world because you really cannot accept that. I'm not inferior because I'm an immigrant. I'm not inferior because I have an accent. I'm not inferior because I'm brown. We talk a lot about white and black racism. Racism does not choose who is going to be against. It depends on where you live in the United States. It depends on what neighborhood you live. You feel racism the same way. It's a structure of domination, of oppression that does not select. Of course, African Americans are the ones who mostly are suffering racism for hundreds of years, but let's not forget indigenous peoples. Let's not forget immigrants who have been here for a long, long time, Mexican Americans, Filipinos, any number of groups were here. And including the history, we have to challenge the idea of white supremacy because not everybody who came here, such as the Irish, were whites. They became whites. So the idea of the whites is a construction that some groups determine over time, the historical aspect of why I don't take it that it's a fixed aspect. So from the perspective of health, I would add to this, the idea that this campus has to open to communities. We have to be a campus community all along. I'm never happy to see that we have to go to the community as if the community cannot come to our campus as much as we can go to the community. I believe it has to be a campus very open to the community in all aspects, physical aspects, ideological aspects, political aspects. We are in Dorchester. We cannot support a project that would displace folks from Dorchester. There cannot be a Dorchester city in our campus that we are not participating to figure out how many people will be gentrified, expelled, displaced. We have to be the ones that make our zip code democratic. Because one of the aspects I would like to add is that we live in a society that zip code determines how long you're going to live. The campus cannot accept this as part of our education. We have to dismantle the structure of this society that defines how many years you're going to live just because where you were born and where you live. We are territories. We have to define our territories, boundaries in a different way. Our campus cannot be in a peninsula. Our campus has to be in Dorchester, in Roxbury, in Jamaica Plain, in the greater Metro Boston. We have to geographically be a lot more bound to where the students come from. And I believe this pandemic left very clear. We talk naturally. Oh, we can't really open our campus very much because our students come from communities that have a higher incidence and prevalence of the virus. It's not because they are Latinos or Black that they have more prevalence. It's not because of their race. It's because of racism. It's because of the way we structure our neighborhoods and also the way we structure our work. I am a scholar of trying to understand how immigration and work relate. And we have plenty of evidence to show that we live in a society that's it's like a ladder. Those who are in the second, third, fourth ladder, steps of the ladder, look for ones at the bottom and say, I'm superior to you. Every single step of the ladder, you have better health aspects than those who are below you. And that happens in the workplace, that happens where you live, that happens where you go to school, that happens when you play, that happens when you pray, which is the concept of environmental justice that we work with. So there are lots of aspects that we need to address, but we cannot address what happens inside the campus without understanding our relationship to the communities. And this has to be a lot deeper than what we have now. This conversation we are having today has to include the groups who are working against gentrification in Boston, the groups who are working against gentrification in the schools, the groups who are working against environmental injustice, such as what happened in Roxbury. We can only prevent our campus or lead our campus to become anti-racist if we ally ourselves to all the groups in our city, in our neighborhoods, who also are in the front lines to fight this. We only can do this together. We're not going to change our campus without the permanent, continuous contribution of the communities where the students come from and where they go back to. And that means including their parents, including the churches, including the clubs, including a whole community of people who are with us. I'm sure they are with us. And our university has this major role, being the only public higher education institution in Boston to do that. Harvard's not going to do that. MIT is not going to do that. Northeastern's not going to do that. We have to, BU is not going to do that. Either we are going to do it and we're going to be able to show how we actually build this network of people that actually work together. And then it's going to become even easier to solve many of the problems we're talking about. Because if we are engaged with those communities, many of our problems will be easier to solve. The students will feel much more at ease. Since we're talking about this ease, they are not at ease because we are not really engaged with the day-to-day lives that they live. And from the health perspective, I am the one who believes we should look at health 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I want to know how you eat, how you sleep, how you pray, where you have fun, etc. And racism is involved in all of those and undercuts all the possibilities of people to have decent human lives. We're all humans, and we have to find ways to unify ourselves as humans. Actually, our race, biologically speaking, is we are humans. We are all humans, and we have to find ways to unify us around this. And to fight racism is what allows us, will allow us to actually become humane with a big H, capital H.
Thank you very much, Brother Eduardo. Thank you very much for your passion. We must move on to Ms. Lisa Owens, who is the Executive Director at City Life Vida Urbana. Her expertise is in local grassroots social justice organizations, and I understand that she may need to leave soon, so make sure if you have any questions specifically to her to put them in the chat box or the Q&A section as quickly as possible. Ms. Owens, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I was completely fired up by Eduardo's talk. Thank you so much for continuing to bring up the question of power And I saw Sarah had a question in the Q&A section specifically around power and Dorchester, displacement and gentrification. So I think these are definitely the themes that we should be talking about when we're talking about racism, when we're talking about health. You know, I come from the assumption, and I hear that everyone who has spoken so far also believes that this is a question of power. So racism is not, right, how I feel about you personally. Racism is not simply discrimination. Structural racism is about power and systems, right? And so my belief is in order to address racism, you're really talking about building power for the purpose of transforming systems, and specifically transforming the oppressive systems of white supremacy and capitalism and heteropatriarchy. So I think I'm in good company here. So my work really quickly is with an organization called City Life Vida Urbana. We are a 47-year-old housing justice organization. We got our start back in the 70s when there were lots of intersecting movements around dismantling racism, making connections with anti-imperialist movements around the world. And it was normal to hear about school busing and anti-displacement and solidarity with people who are also fighting liberation movements, all in the same meeting, right? And dismantling capitalism. So we come out of those roots. We come out of the tradition of literally putting your body on the line. And so when your neighbor is getting evicted, you and 200 of your closest friends go in front and stand in front of the door and dare the police to go through your bodies to evict your neighbor. That's the tradition that we come out of. And we had a direct action at the courthouse today. So we believe that we have to put our bodies on the line. We have to organize for power for the purpose of transforming our economic and political system. So that's what we mean when we talk about addressing racism. And I am typically the person who is called on to sound the alarm, particularly about housing. But I know I don't have to say here that housing is a social determinant of health, meaning that how the structure, the historical structures that have shaped, as we were hearing about zip codes, that shapes who gets to live in which neighborhoods for how long and for what benefit are absolutely determined by racism and capitalism, and have a direct impact on individual and population level health. So because of that, racism absolutely manifests itself in gentrification, but also in segregation and displacement. And so addressing racism and promoting health also is around fighting displacement. So a few things that I'm going to say right now. So we are in the middle of multiple pandemics. It comes as no surprise, I'm sure. So in addition to the global public health pandemic that we're all in, we are in an economic disaster for working class people particularly, and related to that, we are in a different form of the displacement crisis. So for working class people of color, that we are always in a housing crisis. The shape that this housing crisis is taking right now is a massive eviction crisis, which also we are on the brink of another massive foreclosure crisis. And you may be aware that the last foreclosure crisis was a major siphoning of wealth from communities of color, and particularly from Black communities in Black neighborhoods in Boston. So we are in right now an eviction crisis, and we are also on the verge of a foreclosure crisis. So our organization works with Black and immigrant folks who are working class people who are using our power to fight against displacement and to change policy so that we have laws that protect working class renters and working class homeowners, and laws and regulations on the big corporations that use existing laws, existing relationships, existing policy to siphon our wealth and to displace us from our communities. So, for example, we in the summer we released a study about evictions in Boston, where we tracked which neighborhoods were more at risk of displacement because of eviction. And we found that Black communities were at a much higher, disproportionately more at risk than any other community in Boston. And communities of color were also disproportionately impacted by the housing crisis. This was before COVID-19. And then since COVID-19, so once the pandemic hit our state, there was a month that we studied right before our moratorium was enacted in April. And we saw that the communities, the highest rate of eviction in Boston were exactly the communities that were already disproportionately at risk before COVID-19. So the communities where essential workers live, the communities, and this means these are the communities that are serving your food, driving your buses, taking care of your children, working at grocery stores. These are the communities that the state was relying on to keep the economy functioning. These were also the communities that were most at risk of being kicked out of their homes. There is a correlation between these two things. And so fighting racism and promoting public health means that you have to look at protecting those communities that are systematically targeted. And that's what our work is. And, you know, there are lots of things that I could say about how bad the problem is. There's lots of data. We study this all the time. We talk about this all the time. But I think what I want to do is I want to leave this gathering of people who really obviously want to do something more to forge relationships between your campus community and the wider community in such a way that you are working in an anti-racist way for the purpose of systems change. So I want to say that, one, I wholeheartedly want to just endorse what Eduardo was saying about how important it is to be in alliance with the community organizations that have a plan for building power. So in Dorchester, there's a great group called Dorchester Not for Sale. They've been working for a few years to keep an eye on predatory development projects that come into Dorchester, and they use people power to force the city to deal justly with the neighborhoods. And this amazing group is part of a larger group that comes together across neighborhoods to put on what we call our citywide People's Assembly. The People's Assembly is an alternative governing space where people who are affiliated with organizations and not affiliated with organizations come together to create an agenda for the city of Boston that is just, that is anti-racist, and that shows what real participatory planning and development should look like if it's in the people's hands. That body of people is coordinated by the Right to the City Boston Coalition, which is a coalition of base building groups led by people of color who are working at the intersection of housing, climate justice, transportation, and health. So I really encourage people to be connected to this very robust network of community justice organizations that are neighborhood based. And then the second thing that I'll say that I'll leave you with is that we right now are in, it's not dramatic to say, a fight for our lives. So we were one of many, many, many organizations that were able to, one, get the country's strongest eviction and foreclosure moratorium in the country. We fought for that in Massachusetts. It took us 5 weeks, and it was truly an amazing undertaking. We pressured the governor to extend the moratorium, but he lifted it on October 17th. Now, from October 19th on to today, over, our conservative estimate is that there are 105,000 households across the Commonwealth who are, one, unable to pay their rent, two, have massive back debt in the form of mortgage debt or back rental debt, and three, will be at risk for displacement because corporate landlords the practice has been pre-COVID, and what we are seeing now, even in the past week, is that corporate landlords would rather raise their rent during a pandemic, go figure, kick these tenants out and search for higher paying tenants to come in for profit, not for public health, not for any being a good corporate actor, a good corporate neighbor, but even now in this time when we all are breathing the same air and are at risk of contracting the same disease together, this disease is leveling us in a very particular way. It doesn't matter. Profit is profit, and that's the motive, the driving force of the capitalist system. So all of this is to say that we are facing an onslaught of evictions and foreclosures, and there's something you can do about it. I encourage everyone to help us advocate for a bill that's in the State House right now. It's Bill H5018. This is the Act to Guarantee Housing Stability. Call Governor Baker, call Representative Senator Spilka and Representative DeLeo, and ask them to urge them to pass the Act to Guarantee Housing Stability so that we can stave off 100,000 households facing displacement and potential homelessness. Thank you so much.
And that is Bill H5018, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Put that in the chat box so that people will stay with people. Thank you so very, very much for your most informative comments. And I think in many ways, your overview, Ms. Owens, responded to a question that came from the audience. And that question was for the panelists to consider the Dorchester Bay City development, and if there are racial equity aspects to the impact of the Bay City development on the Dorchester community. And really, moving forward, how can we prevent displacement of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and working poor residents of Dorchester as a result of development? And I think you gave us some really concrete steps and strategies. So I'm going to move to another question, if I might, on critical race theory. A student in the audience mentions that critical race theory is critical to her scholarship. So in light of recent events, can panelists discuss what the consequences are of the September 22nd executive order on UMass Boston regarding anti-racist practices, trainings, pedagogy, morale, and culture? Would one of you or all of you, we only have 5 minutes because we have another cluster to hear from, but really quickly, thank you, Rosalind. I will ask you to respond.
Yeah, just I'll try to be quick about it. I just want to say that already it's having impacts in terms of people canceling events. And hopefully this is not an order that will be in effect much beyond January 21st. But I wanted to point out, I want to encourage people to actually go to the language of that, because it's very instructive for how white supremacy operates in very insidious ways. And so that language for that executive order flips the script in a way. It basically frames anti-racist efforts as racist. It frames, critical race theory as divisive, as un-American. And it actually cites abolitionists and civil rights leaders in that language. I'll put the post in there, and I'll also share a piece that I wrote that's kind of related about the ways that this script is flipped sometimes in the way that efforts to achieve justice are framed as divisive.
Yes. Thank you very much, Rosalind. Eduardo or Lisa?
Nothing to add.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very, very much. And we look forward to that resource in the chat box, Rosalind. So now I'd like to introduce the final cluster of presenters on tonight's panel. And the third cluster, the focus is on historical archival legislative models to help us tear down institutional racist structures, interventions that have been made in the past to help us think about moving forward at our local campus level, at the city level, and beyond. So we'll start off with Representative Liz Miranda, who is a community organizer, politician, and has served as our Democratic state representative for our UMass Boston district since January 2019. Welcome, Representative Miranda, and please share with us your thoughts and action.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Is that a thumbs up? It's been an honor to be here and actually be listening for the last hour and a half to all the scholars that are at UMass and the community leaders, particularly in responding to this issue around this racial reckoning that we are in currently in our country that many of us know as not new. And so to begin, the first thing that I'd like to do is to acknowledge the tribes of the Massachusetts who spoke Algonquin, who Massachusetts as a state word and name comes from those people whose land we are on. And much of Boston was occupied by the Massachusetts tribe. And I just want to acknowledge that because so much of our histories that we are told here in Massachusetts begin with the Pilgrims. And that is not the true way to start. And so it's really important for me to start there. The second is to say thanks and show gratitude to the UMass Boston community and its impeccable faculty and staff who invited me to the Sankofa conversation. And just to acknowledge that although I am a state representative of the 5th Suffolk District, which includes Roxbury and Dorchester, right outside of the UMass Boston community, I have been a Black woman from Boston my entire life. So one job has been 22 months in the making, and the other has been a lifetime of 40 years. And really it's with that spirit that I come to you this evening. I am in the Massachusetts State House, and we just heard from Lisa Owens, and thankfully we have organizations like MAHA, like CHAPA, like City Life, Vida Urbana, and Dorchester Not for Sale, who make sure that we as a people understand that everything is political and that everything in our communities and our lives are currently dictated particularly by the state legislatures across this country that are predominantly male, predominantly white, and middle to upper class. I'm one of only three Black women serving out of 200 legislators in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and Senate, who represent the 351 towns and cities in our Commonwealth. 3. And if we look at the history of Massachusetts government, which started in 1636 and was the impetus for many governments, particularly in the first colonies and across this country, there have only been 12 Black women who have ever served in the legislature. And so when we talk about race and representation, we know that it is a challenge, not only in academia, as we're looking at tonight at UMass Boston and the surrounding community and its role, but looking at the government of Massachusetts, it's incredibly important to look at this history, that it wasn't until 1973 when a woman of color served, and her name was Doris Bunty, and she actually went on to make great contributions, including not only serving the people of her district, but starting the Massachusetts Legislative Black and Latino Caucus, and starting the Women's Caucus. And today, less than 30% of the legislature are women. And then before I go on to sort of my remarks, I do want to acknowledge and say a few things about the word Sankofa, the word anti, and do a quote or share a quote from Dr. Ibrahim X, who I'm so excited is now the head of the Anti-Racist Institute at Boston University. You know, I came to UMass in 1997. I was a junior and senior at the John G. O'Brien School of Mathematics and Science. And I was a gifted student academically, although my world was very chaotic. My mom was a teen mom. She dropped out of Madison Park High School to have me. I came from a large Cape Verdean community and a large Cape Verdean family. And my dad was not in my life. And by the time I graduated high school, I was dealing with the fact that both my father and my oldest brother were being deported. So I come from a mixed status family. And that an older brother, my second oldest brother, Ricardo, was incarcerated and is still incarcerated today in the Massachusetts DOC facility. And when I was going to UMass, I was in a dual enrollment program. And UMass was not sort of this institution that was far out in the woods. It was actually an institution among the people. And it made a huge difference that Dr. Vandermeer was my professor, because he was the only professor that I had had, and the only person that really taught me about sort of the diaspora and my Black history. I was fortunate enough that in high school, in my senior year, I also had a class with Mr. Harris, who taught me a lot about my Black history, but it was until I was 17 years old before I really understood the history of my people. And I never was the same after that. And I want to thank Mr. Vandermeer for that, and Mr. Harris, and also Dr. Carolyn Crockett, who had founded an organization called My Town, where we learned the history of our families and communities and the history of sort of the global impact of immigrants, particularly who had made contributions to Boston. So when we look at the word Sankofa, we look at its definition. There are many definitions, but really about reaching back to the knowledge you've gained in the past and bringing it into the present in order to make a positive change and make progress. And I think that's incredibly important as we're having this discussion tonight. We've all been zoomed out. We also have been all discussioned out, and that we want to make sure that we're not only talking about the truth about the history of Boston and UMass, but also the history and truth of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts loves to share this sort of abolitionist history, and this history of liberalism. But actually, we were the first colony and the first state to institute slavery and make it legal. And we were very wealthy in bringing indigenous people and Africans, enslaved Africans, many who came beginning in 1638 on the ship named Desire here to Boston. And so we shipped people all across this country into the Caribbean for goods, and we made a lot of money in that. And we've erased that history. And we have a history in Massachusetts of erasing things like busing, housing segregation, and the deep ties to racist and anti-immigrant sentiments that we've had in the founding of this state, because we are the state that also had abolition. And we legalized slavery first, but we also got rid of slavery first. And so I think for one of the things I want to make sure in our Sankofa experience is that we remember that we can not only pick and choose what we tell about ourselves, and Massachusetts has the history of that. The second is a quote by Dr. Ibrahim X, who says that to undo racism, you have to identify, describe, and dismantle it. And that statements are not enough. It is the emotional and intellectual awareness of racism that we must understand and also take an active role, that there is no such thing as being not racist. You're either racist or anti-racist. And so when I heard Dr. X say this, I went and kind of looked up the word anti, because so much, folks in the Black Lives Matter movement, folks who really didn't understand the movement went out and bought a lot of books. And one of those books was How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I started hearing this term and I said to myself, as an elected official, but also as a community member of the Roxbury and Dorchester community, what does it mean to be anti-racist? And when we look at the word anti, we know that it's about preventing and suppressing. It is also about reversing and undoing. It is also the opposite of, and it's acting as a rival to, and it's unlike the conventional form. And so I want to suggest to the UMass community that we're looking at not only sort of adding new things to the UMass community to make it more tolerable, to make it more equitable and more just, but that we also should be looking at the things that we need to reverse and undo and be a rival to. UMass has always been in my life in this community, and it's been sad to look at an institution that it was of the community for urban students, first generation, BIPOC audience primarily, serving low to poor to middle class community, mostly of color, mostly of the students who were graduating from Boston public high schools throughout the city. And it was a place of hope and possibility. I had so many people in my friend group that when they graduated from high school chose UMass. I knew so many people in my community, even to this day, that were adults who raised their children and then went back to school to get their undergraduate and graduate degrees. I know so many people that depend on the institutes, the Gaston and the Trotter Institute, for research and data that they use in their everyday lives. So part of this work has to be UMass's commitment to understand who they hire, who they recruit as students, what they elevate as an institution in terms of messaging. What are their budget priorities and how do they budget? What do they prioritize? And what are the policies and procedures that they have in place that dictate what they want to see as an anti-racist institution? And for most people that know, I got COVID in April. My family got COVID. My grandmother actually died, and she was the one who raised me. And my title did not shield me from the decades and decades of pollution that Roxbury and Dorchester have faced. We have 5 times the asthma rate. We died 30 years before residents in the Back Bay because of the community and the environment that we live in. And so what we need to know is that UMass plays a critical role in actually opening its doors to understand that the community outside its doors is struggling, not only the student body, not only the faculty and administration and the staff that cleans the institution, the staff that makes sure that the institution runs, but also if you look at the Columbia Point housing projects that have been right outside UMass's doors since its founding. When we talk about gentrification in this new Dorchester-based city that is coming down the street, we have already pushed people out. We have already not been a good neighbor. We have already declined its student body from the students that actually need UMass, and UMass needs to actually pushing for students that actually can dorm and pay the exuberant costs of a college degree. So I end there with saying that you cannot learn, eat, heal if you do not live in a safe, healthy, and community full of opportunity, and therefore you cannot succeed. And it's important that UMass look at all of its entities, not only what it teaches, but its institution and its messaging to the community that's right outside its doors about it becoming and maintaining a space that they are welcomed, that they are worthy, that they can contribute, and UMass can contribute to the wider community. So it is my hope that we fully fund our institutes and outward facing programs. I also think that UMass can be a leader in ethnic studies. It shouldn't take UMass Dartmouth or Bridgewater State to have a Cabo Verdean Institute, because UMass is centered right here in the largest Cape Verdean community outside of Cabo Verde. And so I would like to see that. It also would be great if they had an institute on Native American, First American studies, because of the impact that the Native American community has had and continues to have on our Commonwealth. I would like to see lots of people of color in major leadership positions, and then that UMass must return to becoming an institution that is not standoffish to the community, but instead opens its doors. And lastly, I would also like to say that, you know, I am in the legislature, but I'm one of 3 Black women, and the burden of many of our issues, whether it's immigrant rights, whether it's environmental justice, economic justice, when we look at the criminal justice system, that is 70% Black and brown, although we make less than 20% of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, much of that burden is on the people of color who serve. And we have to push the other electeds who serve with us to understand. And there is a Boston delegation of 22 members in the State House. And actually there are other folks who represent Dorchester in the Senate and in the House. And I am the only person of color that represents this community. And I'd like to leave that we need to make sure that UMass is not seen as sort of the 5th institution of the UMass mothership, but actually seen as an institution that creates space for people of color and actually helps to improve the quality of life related to all the issues that we're handling on Beacon Hill. And so thank you all for having me this evening. And I'm excited to continue to do this work. It is not clean. It is very dirty work. It is uncomfortable work. It is inconvenient work. But if we do this work and we do it right, generations to come will thank us. Because the community that's right outside the doors cannot afford, it does not have the luxury for UMass to have an identity crisis. UMass must remain committed to its charter and remain committed to changing the pieces of itself that are ugly, even in its own truth. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Representative Miranda. And I just want to make sure that someone puts in the chat box that we are very proud to house and support the Institute for New England Native American Studies now at UMass. So that is, yeah.
Thank you. I did not know that. And that's part of the, the communications that we have to share.
These conversations are so important, right? But thank you so much for your strength, for your vision, and for your energy. Okay, we must move on now to Dr. Corroy Ferguson, who we fondly know as Cuff. His expertise is in clinical psychology, also in the evolution of consciousness, human relations, and I'd like to add that he is the architect of the Spoke Coalition model that was referenced at the first conversation. So, Cuff, welcome. And you are our last panelist before we take, hopefully, before we have time to take 1 or 2 other questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for having the opportunity to talk to the audience and to other panelists about some of the history that's been at play here on campus as well as in the community. When I started thinking about history, I actually found myself going back to my own personal history in regards to structural racism. From day one, I was introduced to structural racism growing up in the segregated South. with all of what that means. So I literally lived in an all-Black community, adjacent to an all-white community, but we did not enter each other's space. And I had the experiences of getting on a bus, having to go to the back of the bus, going to go downtown. When I got downtown, I couldn't go into the front doors of movie theaters. I had to go into a side entrance to go up to the balcony. Couldn't eat at certain kinds of restaurants. Saw signs of colored, white only. That was my childhood experience up until, actually, believe it or not, up until the 50s and part of the 60s. It was still existing. And even today, when I go back and visit my high school, it is still pretty much the same. So I, for example, literally lived 1 block away from an all-white school, could not go there, and had to be bused all the way across town to an all-Black junior high school and Black high school. Now, why do I mention busing? It was one of my first introductions to Boston had to do with busing and all of the policies and things that were centered around that particular dynamic. So when the purpose of busing was to maintain segregation, which is the experience that I had, there didn't seem to be an issue. And suddenly now I come to Boston and busing was a big issue when the purpose was about desegregation. So depending on where you were regionally, you had different kind of historical contexts unfolding. Now let me fast forward a bit to introducing myself into college. And there I encountered another kind of discriminatory experience. I got recruited, got a scholarship to college in Maine, Bowdoin College. And Bowdoin was organized around fraternities. And I got recruited for a fraternity called Sigma Nu. Sigma Nu had a discriminatory clause, a national organization. Brothers of that Sigma Nu fraternity came to me, they were all white, and said, we want to fight it. I said, I'm here to get an education, but let's go for it. We fought it, we won that battle. Fast forward again, I'm still at Bowdoin. I come to Boston in the early wee hours of the morning to visit my roommate who had gone, left the campus during a holiday, and I was going to visit him. It was early in the morning, pre-dawn. I had never seen Boston. I decided to walk around the city just to do some window shopping and to see the city. I got arrested for doing absolutely nothing, walking around. Told the officers, I'm just here early in the morning waiting. They said to me, clear words, that's a likely story. Threw me in the paddy wagon, took me down to some station that to this day, I don't remember where it was. That was my introduction to Boston. Now we fast forward again, and we go to my introduction to UMass Boston. And my introduction to UMass Boston, and the reason why I shared that previous context is that a lot of things hadn't changed from a historical perspective. I got attracted to UMass Boston because of one college, and it was called the College of Public and Community Service. And here was a college that was doing lots of the things that people are now talking about. It was a college that actually, believe it or not, it was one of the first 3 colleges of UMass Boston. At the time, it was called College 3. And it changed, and the name of College and Public Community Service was added later on. It had a downtown presence purposefully. That presence was so that the community could have easy access, and the kind of work that we were doing provided us with easy access to the legislatures and government. And so we got a lot of stuff done with that downtown presence. 1992, after fighting with folks to stay downtown, the college then was transitioned onto the Harbor campus. On the Harbor campus, and I have to be very honest about it, it was like the college was being treated like a stepchild. And a lot of it had to do with not understanding what we were doing. It was the college was created as an opportunity to attract adult urban learners. People had been out in the job market doing a lot of stuff with their lives, but just never got around to getting their BA degrees. And we provided an opportunity for that to occur using a competency-based model, which was a new kind of model for delivering higher education to underserved populations. People couldn't wrap their brains around all of that. Higher administration couldn't say, what are y'all doing over there? We actually had classes in the community. We went out actually, rather than people coming to the university settings, we created agency agreements whereby folks who were actually working in the field could in fact have created an arrangement whereby there was a quid pro quo between them getting higher education and us providing teaching services on their site. All that was going on. And I hear all of the information coming out right now about we need to do. All of that was happening. But because of and I don't really want to relitigate all of it, but we're talking history. You got to know what happened in order to go forward. And this is a part of what the history of UMass Boston. In fact, many of the institutes that were initially founded on UMass Boston, were either started by or run by people from the College of Public and Community Service. That history has gotten lost. And fast forward again, we then saw a systematic effort to dismantle the college. Similar to what Yvette was talking about with Africana Studies. Now, why was all of this happening? Why was all of this occurring? Could we just attribute it to racism? Well, when I ask those kinds of questions, where I get to is, why do people create the kind of dynamics that they create? You know, and the simplicity and the complexity of why policies and practices get institutionalized boils down to a matter of what people believe, what they're reasoning to be true. And beliefs are not truths. They're simply beliefs. Beliefs have to do with thoughts reinforced by emotion and imagination. That's all a belief is. And so when we begin to encounter or begin to ask the question, how do these things happen? Well, what are beliefs? How do they get framed? Beliefs are carried around in people's minds. And they're carried out in people's minds, sometimes at a surface level, and sometimes it's at a core level. When they're carried at a core level, that's when we get into how people operationalize certain policies and practices, sometimes knowingly and sometimes unknowingly. So historically then, the challenge for UMass Boston has been to become more conscious about what it's been doing and what it's not been doing. That's been the challenge for all of the years that I've been a part of it. And I came to UMass Boston in 1979. Do the math.
Well, we're glad you came.
So it's not about talking out of a lack of history. I'm speaking from my own experience and the journey that UMass Boston has been trying to go through in its own evolutionary process. And right now, UMass Boston is at a point, just like COVID has placed us all at a point of reflection, pushing us back into our rooms to think about things. And so UMass also has been pushed back into its room, to think about what it's been up to and where does it want to go. And so we're at a point right now of saying to ourselves, okay, we know that we haven't lived up to our mission. We know we haven't lived up to our vision. We know that we haven't lived up to the kinds of things that we really want to do and the way we want to be. And if we want to do that, conversations need to take place, and that has to be translated into specific policies and practices and carried around in the minds of people. Yeah. So that when they begin to implement things, it's not about, it's integrated into the person who's actually carrying out certain policies and practices. And sometimes it's really about getting the right folks of color in place. Clarence Thomas is not a Thurgood Marshall. Point made. Okay. So I'm just going to leave on this note because I could go on and on. But Cornel West said an interesting thing. And I tie that in with some things that I think about when I think about transformation. There needs to be at least 4 elements at play when you're talking about transformation. One is there has to be acceptance of what is so. We started off the Sankofa conversations around that particular theme, acceptance of what is so. Second element that has to be present for any kind of transformation is the element of inclusion. A lot of mouthing goes on around that kind of dynamic. But what does that really mean when you talk about policies and practices dealing with inclusion? And I can talk ad infinitum around my own journey to become a full professor. That's a whole story in and of itself. Okay. And the third element has to do with once you got those two things in place, it's really about how do you create a climate of harmony? How do you create that? And that has a lot to do with what people were talking about in terms of the cultural kind of ethos that's at play. Is it really about harmony? Can I look at you and see me? Can I do that? And the fourth element that has to be at play actually is, I call it love. Other people call it caring. If you don't care, nothing's gonna happen. Nothing's gonna happen. And interesting enough, Cornel West said this, and I agree with him. He said, justice is actually love practiced in public. Justice is actually love practiced in public. So if we are talking really about social justice, we're really talking about putting in place the kinds of things that we care about that can create that kind of harmony, acceptance, and inclusion. And I'll just leave it at that because I looked at the time and it's now 8:30.
Yes, yes. Well, you brought us to a hopeful ending. Panelists, on behalf of the audience, for opening our minds, for compassionate and modeling that to one another. I don't think too many people knew each other before our panel presentation, and for encouraging each of us to take action. And that's what I think I will leave you with, to look back at that unknown face and to really take a risk in moving yourself, your own agenda, to fight racism. Thank you very much. Please be on the lookout for the next series of our anti-racist conversations. I'm sorry, you see, now you caught me because I don't know the date. I should have that date right here, but it's sort of slipped away. But I'm sure you will get enough notification of when that will be. Be safe. Be who you are. Love yourselves and love others. Thank you very much and good night. Thank you all.